Hi, welcome to this online tutorial on activity and exercise. I'm Chris Kelly, one of the diabetes consultants at Forth Valley Royal Hospital, and the tutorial is based on a workshop that we give at Stirling University for small groups, and this is currently suspended due to COVID. So if you've struggled in the past with blood sugars which either go up or down with no obvious explanation while active, or have experienced hypoglycemia during activity and also overnight, then this workshop will be helpful. It's also a good idea if you're planning on a new activity to have a look at this, as hopefully with a bit of an understanding of different activities and their impact on blood glucose, things will be more successful right from the start. It would be helpful to have an understanding of carbohydrate counting and be carbohydrate aware. So it might be useful to link with the carbohydrate counting tutorial, which is also housed on this website. The plan for this workshop is to try and understand why different types of activity might have different impacts on your blood sugar. So why do some things put your blood sugar up and some things put your blood sugar down? Also, we plan to try and see how to manage insulin and carbohydrates so that you arrive at your exercise session with a safe blood glucose, and more importantly, manage during your exercise session to keep your blood sugars on target and then avoid hypoglycemia, particularly hypoglycemia overnight. Before starting, it would be useful, I think, to list some of the activities that you currently do or are planning to do, and pausing here for a second either to write it down or think about the activity would be beneficial. Okay, with that in mind, so here's a list of previous activities that other groups have recorded. If you can, try and map your current sport or current activity into one of the columns. So looking at the columns, you can see that they split into different exercise types or intensity. Aerobic exercise is exercise that you can continue for a prolonged period of time, and it's often thought of an exercise that you can do while maintaining a conversation if doing it with a friend. Anaerobic exercise, on the other hand, is high intensity and an exercise that can be performed in small bursts. And team sport often fits in the middle, where there'll be a mixture of times where you're able to hold a conversation while in the game, mixed with times where you are very, very active, either sprinting or, for instance in rugby, scrummaging or rucking. The importance between these different types of activity and different intensities of activity is what it does to the blood glucose. So aerobic activity is the activity that one would associate with a gradual decline in blood glucose, and it tends to decline at roughly at 1 millimole for every 10 minutes. Anaerobic activity, on the other hand, is often associated with a slight climb in blood glucose, initially at least, whereas team sports will give a mixed picture. And it's important, I think, to understand these different impacts. One of the reasons why this matters is, for instance, if you're going to do a session in the gym and your blood glucose is higher than you might feel comfortable with, then doing some aerobic activity to start would be helpful. Whereas conversely, if your blood glucose is at the lower end of where you'd feel comfortable, then doing the higher intensity stuff first thing might be of some help. Before we start, it would be useful to think about the relationship between insulin and glucose in somebody without type 1 diabetes. When eating, insulin is released automatically, and this allows for glucose to be stored in the liver, which acts as a fuel dump, and also in the muscle, which can be utilised quickly as the energy for activity. If somebody without type 1 diabetes starts to exercise, then there's a very quick drop in the insulin levels within the body, and this allows for the glucose to be mobilised from the liver, from the fuel dump, and transported to the muscle to be used as energy. In addition, and this is something we probably don't talk about much in type 1 diabetes, the drop in insulin also allows for a significant mobilisation of fat, which is one of the main energy sources for aerobic activity. Thus, the insulin levels are lower, and so fat and glucose can be mobilised as the energy source for the muscle. Thus, the key in type 1 diabetes is to try and emulate this and try and enter activity with an insulin level which is low enough to allow glucose to be transported from the liver and fat also to be transported. If you think about how we exercise, then often exercise is within 2 or 3 hours of eating, and it's therefore key to reduce the insulin dose with the meal in the 2 or 3 hours prior to activity. You may have worked out your insulin dose reductions yourself, or you may have been given some generic information which is just reduce your insulin. There are, however, fairly good pieces of work demonstrating the average insulin reduction required by somebody with type 1 diabetes 2 to 3 hours prior to activity. So thinking about a 30 to 60 minute aerobic activity, then reducing your insulin by between 50 and 75% for the meal just before this has been demonstrated to be the most effective dose. Importantly, everybody's different, so this will not suit everyone, but it's a good place to start from. And certainly our experiences at Stirling when we're doing the exercise workshop is a 50% reduction works really well for our static bike based programme following lunch. So, having eaten and hopefully reduced the insulin dose, fingers crossed, when you pitch up to the gym or wherever you're starting your activity from, your blood sugar's somewhere that you feel comfortable with. This is a crib sheet essentially to try and help manage blood sugars which are not just on target prior to activity. The most important thing to remember is if you've had a serious hypoglycemic event within 24 hours prior to activity, that's an event where you've required assistance to treat your hypo, you should not exercise. The reason for this is you're at extremely high risk of having another significant hypoglycemic episode and coming to harm. The other thing to remember is if you've had a blood glucose of less than 4 and treated it yourself, then you're slightly more likely to have a hypo during exercise and in the period post-exercise, so it's best not to do lone exercise outside. So, unless your blood sugar is between 7 and 15, there are some measures that you can take. Obviously, if you pitch up for exercise and you're having a hypo, then it's absolutely vital that you treat your hypo. You check your blood glucose within 15 minutes to make sure that it's improved, and then much like driving, you wait for 45 minutes. You may obviously not feel like doing much exercise, and that would be perfectly understandable. If your blood sugar is below 7, then essentially it's taking some carbohydrate and making sure that you feel well, and here are a couple of suggested doses. And if your blood sugar is above 15, then it would be wise to check for ketones. Now, probably it's just a mismatch of insulin with the carbohydrate from the previous meal. But certainly if you've got significant ketones above 1.5, then you should treat yourself as if you've developed a mild ketoacidosis. If it's between 0.6 and 1.5, then it might be wise to correct and keep an eye on your blood glucose. You can come up with a scheme that suits you with practice. So now that you've started your activity and you're into the exercise session, how do you keep your blood glucose at a level that is stable? The key for everybody, including those with type 1 diabetes, is to slowly drip feed carbohydrate, and the easiest way to do this tends to be with a fluid mix, either a sport drink that you've bought, which oddly enough come in half-litre bottles with 30 grams of carbohydrate, or one that you've prepared yourself. You can also, of course, work out any other type of carbohydrate that you enjoy and can consume while exercising, and this is particularly important if your activity lasts for more than 30 minutes. With regards to fluid, then drinking to thirst is the key, and this tends to be around about half a litre per hour. Something to remember is while exercising, it is not possible to absorb much more than 60 grams of carbohydrate over an hour unless you are very highly trained. And taking more than 60 grams of carbohydrate is not going to help maintain your blood glucose and almost certainly will give you a dicky stomach. So, you've successfully completed your exercise. What do you do next to try and reduce your chances of hypoglycemia? This depends very much on how often you're exercising and what your exercise goals are. If you are doing regular exercise and activity with an endurance goal, then it will be essential that you refuel quickly once your activity is finished. And the general advice for anybody would be to take roughly 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram over the first 30 to 60 minutes. And also to combine this with some protein in the ratio of 4 grams of carbohydrate to 1 gram of protein. Again, you can work different schemes out for yourself. Milk is often quite useful, and there are numerous products which can be purchased for this which fit that goal. If you're doing less regular activity and your goal is weight loss, then you can probably get away with waiting till your next meal, but being conscious of what your blood sugar is. And then, much like the exercise and activity insulin doses prior to exercise, the key will be to reduce the amount of insulin you take with both your recovery drink, your recovery meal, and then any other corrections or insulin administered for the rest of the day. The general rule for this is the 50-50-20 guide, where you reduce your insulin by 50% for your post-meal snack or meal, reduce any correction to a high blood sugar by 50% for the next 12 hours. And if you've done a significantly intense piece of exercise or a prolonged piece of aerobic exercise, then reducing your overnight basal insulin by 20% again will help avoid hypoglycemia and let the liver become restocked with glucose. One of the other things that you might want to consider is taking a bedtime snack, either a long-acting carbohydrate or, interestingly, roughly 20 grams of protein, which seems to increase the level of glucagon and guard against overnight hypoglycemia. Hopefully everybody's using flash glucose monitoring or Libras now. If not, then contact the diabetes unit and we can ensure that one is available on prescription, providing you've got type 1 diabetes, are on MDI insulin and attained Sterling or Forth Valley's diabetes service. If you are using a Libra, then it's quite interesting how blood glucose and scanned glucose will sit slightly differently during activity. This is a slide of some work we've done at the university looking at the difference between Libra and capillary blood glucose. So after about 15 minutes there's a shift between finger prick glucose and scanned glucose such that the Libra readings tend to sit about 1 or 2 millimoles higher than blood glucose. So it's worth remembering this, perhaps erring on the side of caution with regards to how you take carbohydrate to maintain your sensor slightly higher. However, as soon as you finish, very, very quickly the levels start to come back together again and the usual reliability of your Libra is restored. So, hopefully this has helped with understanding that different types of exercise and activity and different intensities can have a different effect on your blood glucose. That the key part of successful activity and exercise in diabetes is to reduce the amount of active insulin. That carbohydrate while exercising is important, and between 30 and 60 grams is the required dose per hour. And also, very importantly, that after activity and exercise it's important to restock the glucose that you've used from your liver. And the way to do this is to reduce the amount of insulin you take with post-exercise meals and snacks, post-exercise corrections, and possibly also in your overnight basal insulin. All of this is because you're much more sensitive to insulin after exercise. And finally, A tip of taking 20 grams of protein just before you go to bed might also help keep you safe and avoid that horrible overnight hypo that occasionally follows activity and exercise. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you would like further information, then please contact the diabetes department. If you'd be interested in one of the real workshops, then again, if you email the nurses, the website has their email address. We can keep your email stored for whenever we are able to do more one-to-one based activity and exercise programs. Good luck, stay safe, and enjoy the exercise.